Welcome to our new session on the growing US-Chinese tension and its implications on the UAE. Our speakers today will be Dr. Mohammed bin Huwaidan. He is the Associate Professor of Politics and Chairman of the Department of Government and Society in the UAE University, and he has written extensively on Chinese relations. Also, our speaker will be Mr. Marwan Al Blooshi. He's a PhD candidate, a researcher in politics and international relations at the University of Edinburgh. And they will be followed by our two commentators, Dr. Abdulkhalek Abdullah and Mr. Mohammed Baharoon. So we'll start first with Dr. Mohammed bin Huwaidan.
These two broader reasons are linked to approaches in explaining state relations and foreign policies. One of them is the so-called power transition theory presented by Organitsky in his book World Politics in 1958. And this approach argues that uneven
it doesn't work for me.
Have you tried?
Yesterday.
Yesterday, but
It's bare.
Okay. Someone is speaking, so I don't know.
Go ahead. I've just put the mute.
Okay. So this approach argues that uneven growth rate between the dominant ruling power and the rising power in favor of the latter, the rising power, make rivalry and tensions happen. In this case, we have the US as the dominant and the ruling power, and China as the rising power. There is uneven growth in favor of China. So this is not acceptable to the dominant and the ruling power. That's where tension is starting with these two giants. The other approach is the so-called Thucydides trap, coined by Graham Allison. According to this approach, rising power, namely China, threats to displace the ruling power, namely the United States. This, of course, according to him and according to this trap approach, this opened up the door for confrontation, exactly like what happens with Athens and Sparta in the 30 years war called the Peloponnesian War in the Greek time, where Thucydides, a historian, wrote about it. Graham Allison studied in his book, Destined for War, the recent book, found that in 16 cases in which rising power threatened to displace a ruling power in the past 500 years, 12 of them ended in war. So the odds is going against a stable Chinese rise, and according to this theory. Both approaches explain the underlying dynamic in the current relationship between the US and China. The second reason is actually what I and everybody describe it as the rise of the sense of nationalism. Nationalism seems to be today the most widely shared value in China. Trump and Xi have used nationalism to push forward their agenda. Trump has nationalist political slogans such as America First and Make America Great Again. Xi has the same thing, has the national rejuvenation of his national slogan to unite the 1.4 billion citizens. This sense of nationalism brings tension with China because nationalism challenges globalism. The US administration feels that globalization with China benefit the Chinese more than the Americans. And they say that there was about 420 billion US dollar trade deficit in favor of China in 2018. Yes, the number is now coming down, but it still is a huge number still. China owns about 16% of US public debt to foreign countries. Americans are losing their jobs to or businesses going to China. So Americans are losing jobs. So for this rise of nationalism, with this also, this is why the US adopting this hardline policy toward China. John Bolton, in his recent book, The Room Where It Happened, mentioned that Trump uses economic pressure as his strategy to reduce China rising power. So, and not to forget here that in the White House today, there are some people who are anti-China or anti-Chinese. Former chief strategist Steve Bannon is one of them, but the current trade director Peter Navarro is strong anti-China specialist in the White House. Navarro, an economist who wrote a very important books criticizing China economic practices, including his books, The Coming China War and The Death by China, and another book, Crouching Tigers. So these three books with some other also writings where Navarro is actually criticized Chinese model of economic development. Leaders in politics, we always say leaders' choices do matter. They contribute to the extent of conflict. For the sake of his gain to win the election, Trump is blaming China nowadays for the pandemic. This is also add up to the tension between the two sides. Now, so where is this heading to? I think it is heading to a very dangerous situation. If this rivalry not contained, we are heading to a real Cold War that could take us back to the same old Cold War. I do think that the current situation is not yet a Cold War between China and the United States. But I believe that we are in the Cold War making.
Dr. Mohammed, I think we lost your voice there.
My voice, it's working.
Okay, you're back on now. You're back on now.
Yeah, okay. So just to recap a little bit, maybe you lost this point in regard to where is this heading to. I think it is heading to a very dangerous situation. If this rivalry continued, we are heading to a real Cold War. It may happen, repeating the old Cold War with the Soviet Union. This is a very dangerous, I think, if it happens, because the current world problems needs US and China collaboration, not just to disaffiliate themselves. It's okay to be competitive. This is a normal thing that China and the United States compete with each other. This is normal thing. But competitiveness should be controlled within the principle of coexistence. Unfortunately, this is not happening now under this administration. Hopefully, the two countries will contain this rivalry and live with it and live by it within the principle of coexistence. Now, how this rivalry impact the UAE and the GCC countries? This rivalry impact everybody. So it's not only about the GCC. Chinese proverb says, when elephant fight, grass suffer the most. Two big giants here. Okay, you have two big elephants, the United States and China. And definitely if they fight, everybody underneath them will suffer and will be affected. So the US and China are the two biggest economies in the world, and most of world economies' outputs rely on these two countries. So if there is any tensions between them, the world economy will be affected. They are also two most powerful military states. So it's not easy to have tension and rivalry between two major military power, because that will take us to the tipping points. Nobody wants to reach this point. Now, in terms of the UAE and China have recently upgraded their relationship to the level of a comprehensive strategic relationship. This is the highest Chinese level in state relations and international relations. The two sides have strengthened their political or economic or military relations. So the UAE has put itself in a position where it needs to balance its relation nowadays with both strategic partners, particularly at the time of tensions and rivalry are taking place between these two powers, the United States and China. I therefore believe there will be some economic and political ramifications on the UAE and the GCC in general. If I speak about first about the economic ramifications, here I can mention several points. One of them is that this rivalry could lead to rising taxes, and it's happening. It's rising taxes. The United States rise taxes on American products. The Chinese is also doing the same thing on some products. But unfortunately, what the American is doing is that the taxes or the tariff that they're raising they are not raising it only on Chinese products, but they are raising it globally. So if they impose sanctions on aluminum, for example, they are not imposing tariffs or raising tariff on aluminum. They are therefore imposing tariffs on all import of aluminum from the world, including Chinese and including aluminum from the UAE or from the GCC countries. So this could hurt GCC state export to the US. The second point is also this rivalry could affect China investment in the region. There is about 100 billion US dollar of Chinese investment in the GCC in the past 10 years. This is without Iran, just the GCC country, in the past 10 years. Saudi Arabia has about 33 billion, UAE 30 billions, and in 2018 only more than 8 billion US dollar China invested in UAE alone. So there is a huge investment happening in this region. So if this tension and rivalry actually escalated, there could be this kind of investment could be hampered, affected negatively, which could affect both sides, the GCC or the UAE and the Chinese sides. The third point is that the US could punish countries cooperating with China, like what happened in technology. No business with Huawei and ZTE. For example, UK saw that. And the GCC could face the same thing. The US is taking note on the GCC close relations with China in technology. And I don't think this will be just passed through easily. And if the rivalry continue and the tension escalated, I think this kind of collaboration will be actually also affected in the near future. The fourth point is that the GCC has some of the world's most dynamic economies, and they become interdependent with Chinese economy. China is the largest trading partner for almost all of the GCC states. For example, about 15% of UAE total trade is with China. So the rivalry could slow economic growth in China. This kind of rivalry between the United States and China could slow the economic growth in China, which could lead to less trade and less demand for oil, which could impact the GCC revenue, particularly to countries like, I won't say the UAE, but the UAE will be hurt here and affected, but not as some other countries like in the GCC, like Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia generate annually 40 billion US dollar out of its sale of oil to China. Oman, 16.5 billion US dollar is its revenue out of oil sale to China, and Kuwait 10.8 billion US dollar. UAE is about 7 billion US dollar, which is okay. It's a big number, but I don't think the UAE will get affected hardly on this on the oil issues. It's amount the 7.3 billions. It's amount about 11% of UAE total value of oil sale in 2019. Not too big, but it definitely will hurt. 7 billion is not an easy or small number. And the second type of ramifications is the political one. And I think there are 2 points here need to be raised and need to be discussed about this issue. The first one is that the continuing tension could push China more toward Iran. This would not be good things for the GCC. The more close Iran to China, the more assertive Iran will become. China now has been very, okay, I'm running out of time, but I'll take 1 more minute. China been very careful not to lean too much to Iran in order to please the GCC states, namely the UAE and Saudi Arabia. But in the long term, if the tension escalated, China will become closer to Iran for two reasons. One is that there is a long and strong civilizational dimensions to the relationship that creates deep respect for one another, historical civilizations, Chinese and the Iranian. And the second reason is that they both seek to build a world free from Western dominance. Therefore, they share somehow the same concern about the current international order. The second point, politically, is that the US put an ultimatum to the countries of the GCC to choose between the US or China. This could happen if the rivalry between the two major powers escalated to a real Cold War stage. Here, the GCC states has to decide whom to choose. And I would like to talk about this, but I think I finished my 15 minutes, approaching the 16 minutes. Maybe during the Q&A, maybe we can talk about how then the UAE can deal with this kind of situations. And thank you very much for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Mohammed. Thank you very much. Very informative, very comprehensive. I'm sure there'll be a lot of follow-on questions on this. And now I'd like to give the floor to Marwan Al Blooshi to give his own perspective on the topic.
Well, first of all, I would like to say thanks to my friend Mohammed Baharoon for inviting me here. And I'm honored to be in the company of such distinguished set of scholars. And of course, a big thank you to Mr. Riad Kahwaji as well. I would like to start in a rather neoclassical IR manner with a quick reading of the perception held by strategic elites in the UAE about China. By strategic elites, I allude mainly to think tankers, academics, and policymakers. But why is perception important? Suffice to say, perception is a key ingredient in the process of identifying threats and opportunities in the international system. Perception can tell us how states may choose partners and allies, prioritize different items in the making of their foreign policy. I would say the general perception about China in the UAE is positive. The Middle Kingdom is sometimes seen as the other of the West. So yes, it is authoritarian, but that means good governance. And of course, the China model has gained lots of tractions among Khaliji and Arab elites in the last few years. More importantly, China is perceived to be an emerging and a realist great power with no strings attached to it, meaning that it's not tied to the dogma of the international regime of human rights, and there is no colonial memory related to it. So this highly positive perception may facilitate the deepening of understanding between Abu Dhabi and Beijing on different regional issues. Now I'd like to move to the second point, which would highlight the nature of the relationship, which I think is largely transactional. Thus, in return for a secure access to Emirati energy, infrastructure, and economic edge in the region, China would prioritize the UAE as one of its geo-economic partners of choice in the region. The relation is not based on shared values, such as the Western concern for liberal democracy and human rights, which removes points of friction and strengthens the pragmatist basis of the bilateral interactions. This transactional character may prompt Abu Dhabi and Beijing to share the same view on multiple issues, such as countering extremist terrorism, the promotion of regional stability, and maybe, this is a big one, the containment of Iranian regional influence. My third intervention is focused on conceptualizing the role the UAE may play in this abiding Sino-American rivalry. It is interesting to observe members of Emirati strategic elites, such as Professor Abdulkhalek Abdullah and Dr. Mohammed Baharoon, newfound belief in the UAE as a rising Middle Eastern middle power. While a solid case might be acknowledged, I wonder how an emerging great power such as China may react to the rise of a middle power such as the UAE. Can the Chinese socialize their Emirati counterparts onto increasing the degree of their strategic autonomy away from the US? But what about the Americans? American strategists see great power competition with China rather than countering terrorism as their country's new primary security concern. Because of this, some suggest that Arab Gulf states may no longer be as relevant to the United States geostrategic calculus as they once were. However, Gulf Arab states may constitute a key part of the puzzle of countering China's military and economic footprint. Among the Gulf states, the UAE stands out for its geographic proximity to the Straits of Hormuz and Bab el-Mandeb. Besides the maritime domain, the UAE holds considerable sway over the great powers contest for influence over markets across the Middle East. So how can an Emirati middle power utilize these advantages in the Sino-American competition? I'll leave the question open and up for debate later on. My last point would touch on the question, how can the UAE utilizes its leverage to entice China away from regional competitors such as Iran? Well, the simple answer might be no. Historically, China's behavior in the region has demonstrated no signs of taking sides, and Beijing is subtle on this point. And but with the gradual American pivot from our region and the ensuing security vacuum, this might change. Moreover, the rise of the coalition of the willing in the region, which basically includes two middle powers, the UAE and Saudi Arabia, may alter China's, Iran, and Gulf's policy. Having said this, both Abu Dhabi and Riyadh will not perform the same role that Tehran does insofar as debilitating the US in the region, which is highly profitable for China. And it's not clear for me if the UAE and Saudi Arabia can overcome the systematic constraints in the regional order and their busy engagements through multiple fronts in the Middle East to shift the regional equation with the help of any external great power. I came to the end of my intervention. I hope it enriched the discussion, and I'll be waiting for some stimulating debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Marwan. Before we move to our two commentators, I would like to point that all the participants who would like to have any questions, please use the chat button to tell me so that you have a question. You either write it in the chat or tell me that you would like to ask a question, and I will give you the floor. Now I would like to give the floor to Dr. Abdulkhalek Abdullah for his comments on the presentations we've heard. Dr. Abdulkhalek, unmute. Use the icon over there to remove the mute.
Okay, I did. Thank you.
Okay.
I'm very illiterate technologically, so thank you, Riad. And thanks, my friend, Dr. Mohammed bin Huwaidan, and our rising Gulf specialist, UAE specialist, Marwan Al Blooshi, for their comments. I have one major comment and a couple of questions. It depends on how much time you're willing to give me here, Riad. But let me start with my quick comment. There is this tension, rivalry, competition, sliding into Cold War later on maybe or whatever. But this tension between these two giants, militarily giant, economically giant, superpowers, China and the United States, come at a time, very interesting time, a very historical shift in our awareness of where we are at this moment, ours meaning UAE and Arab Gulf states. I have seen in the past at least 10, maybe 20 years since the beginning of the 21st century that there is a growing awareness in UAE among the people, government, strategists, etc., about our affinity with Asia in general. We are at a point where we all of a sudden see ourselves as part of rising Asia. And that awareness is growing by the day. And it is part of Asia rising, it's part of China becoming an Asian power, a global power. So this tension has come at the time when there is a gradual shift in our awareness and our perception of our geographic and our civilization, maybe affiliation with the future of where the center of power is going to be, which is Asia, not just China. That includes India, Korea, Japan, China, etc., etc. And I think that is very important dynamic that is happening there, by the way. And so we're shifting our awareness from Europe, America, westward to Asia, China, eastward. And this awareness is growing by the day, and it follows our interest too. Our oil, wherever our oil goes, everything goes with it. So it's interesting to locate this tension in this growing awareness of where our affinity lies. And I'd like to hear Dr. Mohammed maybe to comment on how significant is this in this dynamic as to where we're going to be 20 years, 10 years, 20 years, 50 years down the road as Asia rises in general, as China competes with America, as America shows confusion that it is going through, as Europe is not acting as it used to. Where are we in this whole historical dynamic going from east, where we have been in the past 50, 100 years, to maybe coming during the 21st century? That's my first comment. And if there is any reaction from Dr. Mohammed, I would highly appreciate it. Now to come to my 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever question, let me limit myself basically to 2 of them. And this has to do with using terminology and the right concept to describe this tension. We use, many of us use this tension, rivalry, competition, a conflict, but we have not yet come to really grasp it intellectually and analytically. What is the best term, concept to describe this US, China, whatever is there? Bringing Cold War terminology to it is really an intellectual, intellectual poverty. It doesn't really help bringing something from the past, from the 20th century to 21st events. We definitely have to distill with that Cold War term to describe what is going on, and somebody has to come up with a terminology that is fitting. So what is the right concept to describe this growing whatever between these two giants? My second question has to do with the threat coming from Washington. It is growing. We have been hearing it loud and clear, at least twice in the last 2-3 months, where America, Washington, not just anybody, but officials are saying to us, you are either with us or against us. They are very clear on this. And I think this narrative coming from Washington is going to bombard us for the time being. How do we best deal with this, either with us or against us? Do you see any response? I have not seen yet any response. Do you think it's about time that our officials in UAE and the Gulf respond to this one way or the other, say something about it? We have not. We've been silent, we have been quiet. We have heard it from Schenker, we have heard it from American officials, either with us or against us. We have not heard from Riyadh, we have not heard from Abu Dhabi, the two most important capitals. Do you think, Dr. Mohammed, Marwan, it's about time that we come with a statement, either reacting to it? That's the first question. Second question, I also see something very interesting happening down the road. That is Russia-China alliance. Facing America, India, maybe potential alliance. Do you see that in the making? And if that happens, it just fragments things and it just, explodes Asia into two halves. 1+ billion Indian with America, 1+ billion China with Russia. Is this dynamic? Do you see anything along the line forming as we move on in this tension? Is that a likelihood? Russia-China axis versus India, US-China, and what would be our reaction to that? And finally, I think I don't want to spend too much time. There is also a likelihood for a EU joining US, a US-AU working together to impose sanction against China. It's been talked about. Many in the European Parliament are contemplating it. Is there any chance for a sanction, an EU-US economic sanction against China, which has been blamed for this coronavirus economic fallout? If that is to happen, if there is a package that is being now cooked or sometimes is in the making, if that EU-US economic sanction imposed on China because of blaming it for corona, where would we stand, Mohammed and Marwan? I just wanted to pose this question and these comments, and I would definitely be happy to hear a reaction from my two dear friends. Thank you, Riyad.
Thank you, Doctor. Mohammed, also would like to hear your comments now.
Thank you very much, Riyad. Dr. Huwaidan, Marwan, this was very rich, and as you can see from Dr. Abdulkhalek's questions, you've triggered a lot of contemplation. I want to make a few points very quick, very focused, and hopefully ending up with a question. The first issue, which Dr. Abdulkhalek alluded to, the idea of describing this type of, we're talking about the growing tension. This is the current reiteration of the relationship between China and the US. But that reiteration is just the current one. Previously, during the Obama administration, China has always been identified as the main strategic competitor or rivalry. This is for you to debate the description. But however, Obama's approach was that we need to fight China on its economic landscape. And part of the withdrawal from the region, part of looking inside, allowing fracking and shale oil, was to gain an economic power to compete with China economically, not militarily. Now, this current reiteration under the current administration in the White House had a different approach, but it's pretty much the same direction. My question with the current tension, is this only China focused? because we've seen, for instance, sort of criticism towards any type of multilateral organization. We've seen criticism to NATO, we've seen criticism to OPEC, we've seen criticism to WHO, we've seen criticism to the UN. So there has been a growing sort of discontent towards multilateralism. And I think to see this with what's happening with China, it might make it less, China focused or China centric than it is. The second one is that where is Russia in this? Russia used to be the arch enemy, not only for the US, but for the entire Western world. Now China is moving up. Does that mean that Russia has got a new opportunity now? Or would Russia, as Dr. Abdulkhalek said, join China in a type of a balancing? The second point is the idea that Dr. Huwaidan mentioned, the Cold War, which would possibly lead to, in a Cold War that you have camps. So there's a polarization. And if there is going to be a Cold War, as Dr. Abdulkhalek said, you have to be with us or against us, this camp or that camp. Is the world today ready for polarization? Can it be polarized in the same way it used to be, something like 50 years ago? Or is it too difficult for the time being in the setting we're living at for a polarization like that to happen? The last point is on why China? Why is China important to the GCC or even to the rest of the world? China being the major, let's say, trade corridor. The Belt and Road is a corridor. It's a trade corridor. It's an economic corridor, and that's part of its attraction, and that's part of its success. It is providing the region, the world, a new way of finding the relevance to the economy. Now, and I think that's part of the lure of China when it comes to the GCC, that is thinking of its post-oil economy as being a trade. But in that sense, China is becoming a major force for globalization. It's not anti-globalization. And this rhetoric, this rising tension, tariffs, sanctions, is an anti-globalization. To what extent can that actually succeed and go on? The second point when it comes to China's importance, it's this non-condescending approach to international relations. China is open with knowledge transfer. Pretty much the US and other Western countries would open it up under certain circumstances, under certain conditions. There are a number of conditions that comes like a price tag when you want to transfer technology. China is not putting those barriers. So I think that's again possibly an area or a chance to reconsider how relationship would be based on in the 21st century. So thank you very much for again this discussion, and looking forward to your comments.
Thank you, Mohammed. And I would like to weigh in from a defense perspective here. Chinese relations with the region on a defense level, traditionally, they were not high. But over the past few years, I would say up 5 years, we've seen some good progress. Still, the scale is too much in favor of the US. The US is the main defense partner for the GCC states. The Air Force, the Navy, all the main defense equipment here are US or Western origin. China, however, has been taking advantage of loopholes. These loopholes came up as a result of frictions we had, especially during or since the start of the Yemen war between the GCC states, especially the members of the Saudi-led coalition, and the Obama administration and some European countries that led to the delay in some defense contracts, but most important in refusal to supply the region here with certain requirements, especially attack drones, UCAV, unmanned combat aerial vehicles. And this opened the way for China to step in. And China has not only provided two of its platforms. There is a Rainbow, the drone known as Rainbow, and the other one is, I think, called the Winglong or Long Wing, something like Winglong, I think. Both have been procured by the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and the Rainbow drone is now being manufactured in Saudi Arabia. I mean, the Chinese gave a license to the Saudi Arabia military industry, SAMI, to build these drones domestically. So it is an entry. We're seeing the Chinese making an entry. And now we see Gulf countries are now more open to look at Chinese technologies because they have sensed there's an improvement. For a long while, China was seen as Chinese defense equipment were seen as replicas of Russian systems. Now they're seeing that now there are things that are being built in China with a Chinese trademark, and they are actually good technology. And so I think we're going to see more and more movement in that direction, not too fast. However, I also would like to add on to China's power projection. The projection power held by China, which is usually when you say power projection is like when countries have the ability to intervene militarily in places far away. So for that purpose, the country would need to have aircraft carriers, a strong navy, with a strong airlift capability. China now has last year launched its second aircraft carrier, and it is building 4 more aircraft carriers that are all going to be nuclear powered. So by 2030, I think we're going to have at least 5, if not 6, aircraft carriers for China operational. These will be moving in strike groups like the US has today. So eventually, we will likely see a Chinese strike group based, if not inside the Gulf region, maybe at the entrance of the Gulf region, taking consideration that the Gulf region is the main source of energy to China. So we will definitely be seeing a growing Chinese military footprint in the Gulf waters, in the Arabian Sea waters, as it does today in the Red Sea, which the other side of the Arabian Peninsula, mainly with the base now in Djibouti. So this we have to add into perspective to the dimensions we've heard now by the presenters, the political and the economic and so forth. So this is something I wanted to throw in for the discussions. Now the floor is open for questions. While you guys might be writing me or signaling me for making questions, I will ask Dr. Ben Huwaidan to weigh in on the questions he heard from the 2 commentators.
Thank you, Riyad, and thank you, Dr. Abdulkhalek, Marwan, and Dr. Mohammed for this beautiful questions. Since there are so many questions, let me say this about the UAE and China. The UAE approach has been to balance the need to enjoy harmonious economic relations with China while keeping closer security relations with the United States. This pragmatic relationship is very important for the UAE. However, I believe the following considerations are very important. And here I need to mention these considerations because it is really for all the GCC countries, not only the UAE, need to think about them before they try to push toward leaning to the China or the United States. First, China will never pressure Iran to stop its policies in the region. We see this in North Korea, where China has even more leverages there, but it does not use it. So however, we need to understand also that even though China will not pressure Iran, but the more closer China to the GCC, the more balanced China will be in its relation with Iran. So China may not pressure Iran, and I think it will never pressure Iran. But the more closer we are to China, so China will be balancing its relation with Iran. And this is very important. All the GCC needs to understand this. Second point, what keeps China from Iran is two things nowadays. First, fear of US sanctions. Second is the Saudi and UAE engagement with China. This is very important. The investment opportunity that China enjoys, particularly in these two countries, makes the Chinese think twice before they go to Iran. This balanced formula needs to be understood by the US. GCC engagement with China is important of keeping the Chinese away from Iran. The third point, China BRI, or Belt and Road Initiative, leads many countries to the so-called debt trap. And you all know this. Countries like Sri Lanka, for example, forced to hand over the control of their harbor, Hambantota harbor or port, a very important location in the Indian Ocean, for 99 years to China, because they cannot pay back their debt to China. Djibouti, 80% of the GDP is debt, and the majority of that debt is to Chinese, to China. Tajikistan, and this is even worse, Tajikistan had to exchange territory for debt relief. Imagine this. I mean, the Chinese had to take territory of other countries. They are not easy to handle, the Chinese, so they will be very careful to deal with. Many countries nowadays is close to this trap, including Pakistan, Kyrgyzstan, Laos, Maldives, Mongolia. These countries are very, very close to what we call the debt trap. States need to be careful when they become involved with the Chinese financial project. The fourth point, China, as I described it, is a semi-revisionist or a semi-status quo power. China is not a revisionist state or power. China is not a status quo state or power. And this maybe can answer some questions about the alliances. I think China is a semi-revisionist, a semi-status quo state that seek to both benefit from the current international system and also seek to establish a new system outside of Washington control. So state of the GCC here needs to think twice whether they should be part of such effort to weaken the US or not. This is very important. And the final point, China is not an international diplomatic power. This is a fact. China, it does not want to be one. It is a more of a narrow-minded self-interest state that care about maximizing its national interest and do not care about world problems. So do not rely on China to provide global public goods or to provide settlements or solution to Libya or Yemen or Syria or Iraq or Iran. No, China does not play. I believe balanced relationship between the US and China in the GCC here in our region is important. The GCC can be the place where the US and China can accommodate themselves perfectly. The US can continue as a security keeper, security provider in the region, and China can continue as economic partner. This partnership can accomplish or can complement each other. There is some sign of this happening. For example, China is developing the Duqm Harbor in Oman, a very massive project in Oman. Okay, this is a huge city in Duqm in Oman. Well, the US is leasing facility there in the harbor for its military navy. This is good. So the Chinese investment is not merely for their national interest or the countries that actually this investment is going on, but also for our partner or ally, the United States, which is good from the part of Oman to think this way. This kind of arrangement should be dictating US-China relations in the Gulf. Why is this? Because the reason for this is that the region, our region, the Gulf region, is not an immediate priority for China dominations. Not even in the perceivable future. Chinese do not want to dominate this region. China care most about its region, the Far East. There where China is willing to challenge the United States, not here in the Gulf. China does not want to challenge the United States here. China is benefiting from the United States presence in this region. So we should encourage the US to stop bringing its rivalry to this region, because there's no point to bring this rivalry here. They can take it to the Far East, perfect place. That's where the rivalry can make it or break it, but not here. Here, the rivalry will break things, not make things. Thank you.
Yeah.
Marwan?
Yeah, I would like to comment on Dr. and Professor Abdulkhalek comment about the coming moment of choice that might face Abu Dhabi and Riyadh between the two great powers, Washington DC and Beijing. Of course, I think hedging is for now a wise choice between these two powers. That is for now. But if we in the Gulf, and I mean Saudi Arabia and the UAE, can behave as a singular bloc and convince China that we are one of these dominating blocs in West Asia, which is, by the way, the terminology that is used by China to describe our region, then balancing can be a better choice for us, and it will enable us as well to reap many advantages in this abiding competition. But then, how can we tie in this position to our confrontation with Iran? Well, maybe we can tap into China's time-tested relation with Iran and its leverage over Tehran to build a new security architecture in the region. That is a far-fetched dream, obviously, but China has no frictions with Tehran, and its relations with the Gulf are growing. And obviously there is this feeling in the region that a moment of choice is facing different regional powers, different regional actors, and China might contribute to the building of a new security architecture, at least in the Gulf region and the Arabian Peninsula, to secure this region, to secure its interests, and of course, to facilitate the dominance of China somewhere else. I mean, as Dr. bin Huwaidan said, China is not focused onto West Asia as much as it's focused into Eastern Asia. So we might utilize these contradictions in the making of Chinese foreign policy for our benefit. Thank you.
All right, so I'm opening the floor for questions. So who would like to Who has any questions to throw in? Dr. Riad?
Hello, yes?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you also to our friend, Dr. Ben Huwaidan, all those who also speak about the relation between the United States and China and the effect on the Gulf states. I noticed that there is no mention for the influence of Kuwait, especially with its agreements with China on the road and belt, which is actually amount by billions of dollars, and that definitely will have an effect on the relation between the Gulf states and China. I think the most important for China, the most important difference actually between China and the United States, that China does not intervene in the political arena in the other states and their beliefs. And that's in contrast with the United States and the West, who are always trying to influence the political, the government actually, and the political organization within every country. And that probably it is a kind of balance to have this relation built on economics affairs with the two sides. The problem whether the United States will allow the Gulf states to go ahead with this kind of growing relation with China, or the United States will be antagonized and take actions against the states who go ahead with their growing relation with China. This question actually directed to our friend Dr. Mohammed Ibn Huwaidan, and the others who want to answer, I'll be glad. Thank you.
Dr. Mohammed?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Aid. Again, this is the elephant in the room. This issue, the BRI, this issue that I just heard it from very few, maybe from Baharoon. I don't know, even me, I mentioned it real quick. But this BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, is a very ambitious project. This is for China to make it or break it. This is the future of China. And that's why I am very careful when I study Chinese politics. I'm very careful to study the PRI because I know this is a very dangerous and very tough and really important project that need to be studied, looked at, and from different aspects. The rivalry between the United States and this and China, it's very dangerous. That's why I just want to tell you, it's a rivalry about the supremacy in the world, the domination, who is number one in the world. That's what makes it danger. It's not like any other state want to be dominated in certain regions like Iran or Turkey no, this is about the world. And China way of getting there is the BRI. By the way, if I take the analogy of the current situation that's happening in the US, China says, I cannot breathe. That's what China is saying. I cannot breathe. Why you cannot breathe? Because your knee is on my neck. That's exactly the situation of the Chinese. China wants to breathe, to play its normal role as a leading, most powerful Asian and East Asian state. But the US will not allow it to be so, to play this role. It's surrounding it with all military alliances in Taiwan, in South Korea, in Japan, and even in the Strait of Malacca, where 90% of Chinese oils pass through. So China is frustrated and become aggressive. See, it's like when you push someone to the corner, at the end, this person will react because either he die or do something. This is exactly China. China has been pushed to the corner and now has to react. It's frustrated and it's reacting now. And its reaction become more aggressive. In terms of the Belt and Road Initiative, the Belt and Road Initiative is a Chinese attempt to breathe outside the American sphere of influence. And even it touch countries, and very smart, if you look at the PRI, it's going to places where Americans are not there. Very smart. So they go to Central Asia, they're going to some Asian countries, they're coming to the Middle East, to Africa, where the Americans are not there. It's not their sphere of influence. Very smart in order to establish a sphere of influence for itself. This is very dangerous initiative, very important initiative, and I think all countries has to be wise in dealing with China when it comes to the PRI initiative, including the GCC countries, including the GCC countries. Yes. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Mohammed. Okay, anybody else has any questions?
Yeah, I have one comment.
Go ahead, Marwan.
Yeah, well, I have a little comment here regarding Dr. Ayad's intervention. I think, it's obvious that America's sway over the Gulf is gradually waning. So I don't think that we should be overestimating the US's reaction to our increasing ties with China. I think our American partner is still, of course, supremely important, but we should also take into account the slowly different structural changes in the international system that are happening right now. Secondly, if the two Khaliji middle powers, namely the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, if these two powers can behave as a unified single bloc in West Asia, then we can mitigate, hopefully, the effects of this abiding competition, great power competition between China and the US. So I think the Gulf, especially the coalition of the willing in the Gulf, which includes two countries basically, is in a position to reap the best of advantages and mitigate the disadvantages of this competition that is dawning in the international system, really. I'm not sure about Kuwait's position into this, but maybe Kuwait can free ride the efforts of the UAE and Saudi Arabia. I'm not sure. But of course, Kuwaiti policymakers can make the best choices for their own national interests, obviously. Thank you.
Mr. Riad?
Go ahead, sir.
I just want to, because the point raised by Marwan here remind me of a point raised by Dr. Abdulkhalek about the perception. And I think this is a very important issue. I have always maintained that the US withdrawal from the region is more in our perceptions than reality.
That's true, to an extent.
And unfortunately, it is in everybody's perception in the region nowadays. All the elements of US power in the GCC have remained relatively steady, but recent development have led to some questioning of US will to lead. This is understandable. This has happened in every American administration. This question has driven a growing perception of American withdrawal, unfortunately, or waning. And this perception has driven action that unfortunately have undermined our alliances with the United States. and welcomed the US global peer competitors like China, Russia.
Yeah.
And even now, most of the problem I think that's happening in the region is because of this perception. The problem is that that perception is becoming now a self-fulfilling, unfortunately.
Yeah, prophecy.
That we see happening in the region and around us with the rise of Iran, because we bombarding Iran with the fact that, oh, the US is withdrawing, the US is not reacting, the US is leaving us. Iran is feeling so good. And Turkey is the same thing. The growing Chinese presence is the same thing. The Russian, even the breakdown within our system with Qatar is the reason, one of the reasons is this perception that we think Americans do not care about us and they're leaving us.
Yeah.
I think this is very important and very dangerous. Everybody is hedging against US withdrawal. Everybody. Everybody is hedging against US withdrawal, unfortunately. This is very dangerous. And my assessment, because in my assessment, because of this, our alliances is weak. I believe strong alliance has to reduce the fear of abandonment and entrapment associated with theory of alliances. This is the responsibility of two parties, the NATO, the West, the America, and the GCC countries, to work together to establish a formula that brings some kind of relax to the GCC country, that take away this kind of fear of abandonment or entrapment in which different administration in the United States, unfortunately, is not giving and is not doing.
At this point, I would like to introduce a good old friend who can shed good light on this topic here. I would like to introduce Dr. Herman Perchner. He is the president of the American Foreign Policy Council. Herman, you've heard a lot of what's been said so far, so please give us your take on this. Is the US pushing the region towards China? Is the US abandoning the region? Let me hear your thoughts on this.
Okay, a couple comments. First, I want to go to the comment you made about the aircraft carriers that will, in some years, be in the Gulf. It's a mistake to think the Chinese behavior will be the same then as it is now. When they have increased capability, they will be conducting themselves differently. And it's not just about aircraft carriers. If you look at what China is doing in space, where their declared intent is to have dominance in space in a few decades, this also will affect Chinese worldwide behavior. If the US is not aggressive in matching or besting China in space, there will be no secure communication. There will be no energy competition. One of the things, of course, China wants to do is to collect solar energy and beam it to Earth. And that's technically possible now, and there are proof of concept experiments being done by China. So the main point is Chinese behavior will change as Chinese capabilities increase, and Chinese capabilities are on track to increase dramatically. Second point, no matter who comes to the White House, tensions in China will continue to increase, absent, for whatever reason, Xi being denied a third 5-year term into 22. You can make perhaps an entire conference on who is responding to who in terms of China and the US. Is the US responding to Chinese aggressiveness, or is Chinese worried about US positions in boxing them in? But what began the struggle in the South China Sea? Was it because of the US, or was it because of China exercising territorial claims? And so forth and so forth. You can go through intellectual property, you can go through many other aspects of Chinese behavior. But the main thing is, for whatever reason, the US will become more aggressive in confronting China. It will, that will exist no matter if it's a Democrat or Republican administration, and whatever feelings that were existing and whatever strategic change were building up in both parties, all that has been amplified by Chinese conduct during the coronavirus. That has added an emotional element here in U.S. politics, which was absent prior to the virus.
Herman, do you see the U.S. Retracting from? I mean, we've heard a lot about the issue of pivot to Asia, and the U.S. is, and this has created a strong perception regionally that the U.S. is abandoning the region, and some people are like wondering whether it's time to start exploring a new partner. Maybe it could be China, could be Russia, or whatever. Is this, how true is this perception?
It depends who comes to power in the U.S. and even what faction holds power should the Democrats win the election in 3 months. So I think the safe thing for other countries is to watch what happens in 30 days or in 90 days, and especially what team would staff the White House and the security establishment should there be a Biden presidency. And I say that because there are significant differences within the Biden camp on how foreign policy and national security policy would be conducted.
So this perception is to an extent true. I mean, depending based on who could be in the White House, we could see the US becoming less engaged in the region.
It's possible, but it's possible also there would be more engagement.
So it's either way.
Yes.
So and this
I think it will clarify, at least in the short term, by the end of the year or early next year.
So we're talking here about a new definition for alliances. So it is no longer, allies and everything and forever. It is now per piece and based on who is in the White House. So the region here should no longer assume that the U.S. is 100% forever. Like it's not like a BFF, forever best friend forever thing. It is a whole new reality then.
I think the reality has changed. The question is how much has it changed, and how fast will it continue to change.
That's very, very interesting. I know that you have a very long experience, in the U.S. With the U.S. administrations, and you've done a lot of work on U.S.-China. So that's why I believe that your perspective is very valuable here. Dr. Huwaidan, what do you think of these ideas we heard from Herman now?
You see, there is always, everything is possible in politics. But about 3 years ago, I wrote a book called The Unholy Alliance, the relation between the GCC and the United States. And I surveyed this relationship from the beginning, from its beginning since World War II, after World War II. And I found that there's always, this alliances gets into this ups and down. Okay, there is always this perception whether the United States will leave or reduce its commitment to this region or not. But at the end, I found that this commitment is continued. And the reason why, I think, because the main major interests that actually bring the regions and the Americans together are still valid today. Oil is still important, no matter what everybody say, whatever they say. Even if they say, well, there's shale oil and whatever, oil is still important. If it's not important to the United States, it's important to China. Therefore, if they have a rivalry with China, they know this is the place where China can get its oil. 50% of oil, imported oils of Chinese come from this region, therefore, or from the Middle East. Therefore, they need to control this region in order to determine to some extent the destiny of China economy in the future. So this is an important one. Second point is that the United States has always wanted this region to be its own dominant region. So it wants to dominate this. It doesn't want any rival state to dominate this region, whether the Soviet Union, Russia, China nowadays, or even Iran nowadays. The United States doesn't want anyone to rival its presence in this region. So even though the Americans' presence is a little bit, it's not as big as 10 years ago, but it's still, their presence is there and in a large number, and they're still functioning and doing their business as usual. Third, the United States always eyes Israel, and they know Israel has a very impact on American foreign policies. And the Israelis will never leave these regions to Iran dominations. And therefore, this is an important reason as well. And the fourth or the fifth, or whatever number is, the United States wants to keep its domination to the world. And there is over 700 military bases worldwide the United States has worldwide. Most of them are actually stationed in this region. Therefore, they cannot, this is their tools, their means toward dominating the international or the world. Therefore, they cannot leave this region to nobody else other than themselves in order to achieve. Now, whether this will be within new administrations, the strategy will change, maybe. I'd like to differentiate between two things. The main national interest and the strategy to achieve the national interest. And the national interest of America is there, it's still here. Yeah. It's not changed. What's changed is the strategy to apply this. And this is normal. We are with this from the 70s. The Americans think the best way to do is to go in by themselves, or no, to stay outside and let them to do it. And we support them from outside. This is normal. And this is what we're going to see with America in this region. They come directly or they let us do the job. Yeah. And in both ways, they are here. They're not going to leave.
I would like to go back to the point of perception, perhaps, and pose a question to Dr. Ben Huwaidan. How does China see the rise of Saudi Arabia and the UAE as regional middle powers? And do the Chinese think of us as middle powers, really? And how can that affect, in the long run, China's time-tested partnership with Iran? I mean, I would like really to go back to my second point. I mean, how can we entice China from Iran? Do we have that kind of a leverage going into the future? Thank you.
The only thing in terms of our relation, in terms of China relation with Iran, the only thing we can do is to make China balance its relation with Iran. That's the only thing we can do. I don't think any GCC country or Gulf countries or Middle Eastern countries can redirect China's relation with Iran. There is a huge interest the Chinese sees in Iran. They don't want to let it go. And there is traditionals and civilizational respects between the two countries. I think the only thing that we can do is by pushing our relations, the GCC, like mainly Saudi Arabia and UAE, because this is the real prize for China, economic gains. If they push toward getting closer to China, economically at least, that would at least lead us to use our leverages to make China balance its relations with Iran, but not to pressure Iran against any kind of policies that we favor, but to balance their relations with Iran.
I'd like to see if our commentators, Mohammed Baharoon, Dr. Abdulkhalek, have any points to weigh in.
No, I'm happy with almost everything I heard, and I agree with everything I heard from Mohammed and from Marwan. So at the end of the day, we are stuck with this China, US whatever you want to call it, tension.
What would you call it, Mr. Abdulkhalek?
I don't know. We will have another session just to come up with the right terminology. But I think it is here to stay. It's going to be here for the next 2 decades to come, and well into the first part of the 21st century, and it's going to have a huge ramifications for UAE, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf Arab states. We might be, like Dr. Mohammed said, we might be the first really to suffer from the fight of these 2 giants and 2 elephants. So unless we get it right, we might pay a lot of price. And this kind of conversation is what we need to have.
Yes.
And we'd like to hear also back from our friends from the United States and from China and from Europe, just to make right policies and right strategies for the years to come. Thank you, Riad, for organizing all of this.
Thank you, Dr. Abdulkhalek. Mohammed Baharoon, do you have any last comments?
No comments, but takeaways. I would agree with Dr. Mohammed bin Huwaidan that this could potentially be a dangerous situation, not for the GCC, but for the world order as we know it. 2, that the GCC countries are trying to play the ball-bearing role, the balancing role. And I think this is a difficult thing to do, but so far it has been happening. However, it's an extremely straining situation. It's like juggling a couple of balls or 3 balls on while walking on a wire. So this will mean that people have to be very vigilant and continue engaging on different levels and maintaining the pragmatic approach, which I totally agree with Dr. bin Huwaidan. This has to be a pragmatic approach and pragmatic relationship. And I think the third point is that we also do not live in a vacuum. So the impact that is happening from this type of pressure, if you look at, for instance, the position of Italy towards China, you could see that the fault lines are not exactly here in the GCC. They're also in Europe. They're not only in Asia. They are also in South America. So there are multiple fault lines. It's not one. And I think one could affect the other. So just to think that the situation is contained here in the GCC, and if we get it right, it will be right, this might not be the case. So thank you very much.
Well, I would like to conclude by saying here that the Arabian Peninsula, the Arab Gulf region, geographically, it is of highly strategic importance to the global powers. We sit at major strategic pathways, the Hormuz, the Bab el-Mandeb. It is the largest reservoir for oil and gas. And it sits right in the middle of, linking the 3 main continents, from Africa, Asia to Europe. Therefore, the significance of this region will always be high to all the global powers or the aspiring global powers, US, China, and the others. And therefore, it is up to the countries of the region to adopt a very pragmatic policy in balancing the interests, of these powers, along with their interests as well. Was the advantage, was the disadvantage, and so forth. But being pragmatic is the key. Being pragmatic is quite essential for these countries to operate and to function in a very positive way. So I would say, before we close right now, just we have just 2 or 3 minutes, just in case anybody has any last question. Otherwise, we will end our roundtable here.
Hello, just one small comment if there's possibility.
Sure.
Yes, actually I agree. First of all, I thank you, Mr. Mohammed, for inviting me to this great session. And I agree actually totally with what you said about the balance of power. And we have the experience here in 70s and 80s, the Kuwait states, which they had balance of power with USSR and United States, and particularly in the Stinger situation that time when they applied and they couldn't. They refused the United States. They went to USSR and, on that time. The balance of power could help more in this situation. The other thing, the United States strategy actually in this area is they have two places with Israel and the Gulf region. They have two. They are securing these states. And these states also securing the interest of United States in this area. For this reason, I think the balance of power and the strategic, I don't think that will be that anything is affect on the relation of the GCC with United States. It's maybe growing up, but maybe it's not will be the, I mean, in the same time by both sides, which is the United States with the GCC may be more going to be closer to the United States, and also in the economically, which is economic diplomacy, they are more interesting to be now with the China because they have a strong economy in that area. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, at the end, I would like to say that the U.S. has been for a long time an established partner. Global power partner for the countries of the region. If China was to gain more presence and a bigger role, it will be due to the US pulling out of the region. We can all see the growing isolationism in the US. It's a movement, it's a political movement, it's a political thinking, and President Trump embodies this movement today, and he's at the White House, and that's why we've seen the U.S. disengage from many arenas around the world, in Europe, in Asia, and South America, and Africa, and everywhere. So I think this will have a big impact. The more vacuum the U.S. would leave, the more space would be for other powers, especially China, to fill in the region. And I think GCC states have to keep this in mind and be able, be ready to fill the vacuum and not allow any foreign or non-Arab regional players to fill this vacuum. And whoever is going to come in, that will come in at the terms of the GCC states themselves. If there is no comment by any of the speakers, of the commentators, we will conclude right here. So anything else from Dr. Huwaidan, Marwan, Dr. Abdulkhalek, or Mohammed Baharoon?
No, thank you very much, Riad. You did a good job here.
Can I add one little very fast thing,
Sure.
please? Very quick. I started my intellectual life as a political scientist, let's say, believing in realism. I was a big supporter and believer of realism. Nowadays, I'm fed up with realism. I find myself believe that realism contains me in a
This is not a good attitude, Dr. Mohammed.
it contained me within a certain thinking that is, I should always use balance of power as my strategy to deal with others. I fed up with it. I think I have to think beyond balance of power. I am now preaching and calling for everybody to think with me and maybe read more about this. I am calling for balance of security. Balance of security is something new. I hope everyone can think about it to go beyond this balance of power, which actually bring us into a rivalry, tension, problems, wars, and conflict.
And the respect of mutual interest.
You become a very
I'll add
wise
something.
person, Dr. Muhammad.
Yeah.
دكتور عبد الخالق.
شكرا يا رياض مشكور.
Thank you very much.
دكتور
everybody.
رياض. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Yeah.
thank you very much, everybody. And until we meet again in our next
hope so.
Zoom, inshallah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, sir.